And, you've had Dave Running here before, who wrote The Art of Neighboring. Dave's a great leader in this. And so a lot of what he said, would take you as far as, if you just did that, that'd be great. We did write a book that based upon a lot of our own experiences and the experience of other churches of like, well, so how do you really actually get this into the DNA of your church? How do you become a church that cares about this? And so I'll share a few things that we did that helped instill this into our church. So besides doing the obvious, sermon series, which is helpful, one of the things we did was we were figuring out, like, how do you measure neighboring? And we're like, because, and it wasn't very sexy, to be honest, because it was kind of cool to get your, in the newspaper. LifeBridge does this and, paints a whole school on a weekend. And it was like, but, when you say, hey, just, make sure you help with putting the neighbor's trash back, that's not going to make the newspapers. And so we said, okay, what we're going to do is a bunch of things that doesn't make the newspapers. And we got the guidance and inspiration from a missionary in Egypt who was advising missionaries in Afghanistan. So the Afghanistan missionaries were saying they'd been there for a couple of years, profoundly discouraged, said, we haven't done anything that's made any difference. And so this other missionary said, you're looking at things wrong. He said, I want you to start counting everything as a +1. He said, if you go down the market and a woman looks you in the eyes for the first time, that's a +1. If you get invited over for tea, that's a +1. If you invite someone over for tea, that's a +1. I mean, you're just counting. And if you baptize someone, it's a +1. It's not a +100. And so everything counts. And so we started, okay, everything counts. And we handed out Post-it notes and said, write down everything you do this week. That's a +1. So whether it is like you waved at a neighbor that you've been ignoring, you learned a neighbor's name, you visited at the mailbox, you asked for a tool from the neighbor who has all the tools, just write them down. And at the end of the week, let's collect these +1s. Well, we came out with, thousands and thousands and thousands of +1s within a week, and we started realizing, like, hey, none of these things are going to get in the newspaper. In fact, collectively, this won't get into the newspaper. But all of these things count, and this is the way we need to start looking at our lives and what we're measuring, that everything counts, whether it's something that you did or was done for you as well. And this idea that, we don't have it all together. Be sure that you ask for help from neighbors. And so that was a measurement tool that really helped us see things differently, and that the small things counted, and they counted into the thousands. Another thing that we did was try to run the programs that we already had that existed through a neighboring filter. So, for example, one of the things that we do every year was a food drive. And we tell our people in our church, get the food that, those lima beans in your cupboard, and that had been there for a few years. And then maybe a few other things that is actually good. And, bring them to the church and, have a nice little pile in the lobby, and then we'll donate those to the local food bank. So that was something we did every year. When we started taking neighboring more seriously, we said, okay, how do you apply neighboring to this food drive? And so we said, okay, let's get those little grocery bags and have everybody grab 4. You have 4 bags, and we actually made them pay for them. It's like, and it just said feed 1 on it. And we said, grab 4 of these bags, but you can only fill 1. You're going to have the courage of a Girl Scout and knock on your neighbor's door and say, hey, our church is collecting food for our local food bank, and wanted to know if you were interested in doing this. And so that's what we did. We not only collected by far a record amount of food, but started getting feedback from our church about, I had the most amazing, conversation with some people I've never talked to before, or the homosexual couple, or the people from another country and part of another religion. I mean, so our people are really excited about not just the transaction of a food drive, but the relational connection that happened out of that. It just so happened that within 2 weeks of that food drive is when the tsunami hit the coast of Japan. And what surprised us was our people started coming back to us saying, our neighbors are saying, what can we do? What is your church going to do? And how can we help with Japan? And I mean, we weren't ready for it, but the neighbors had seen themselves in a positive light as being part of the solution. You're like, oh, my church friend doesn't think I'm a problem. They see me as part of the solution. They see me in a positive light. And now that this other thing has happened, and you invited me already into a solution before, well, now what are you guys going to do? So it created more work for us. So I don't encourage that you guys do any of that. So other things you could do are, Halloween's coming up. Instead of having, there's been this movement to having Halloween events at churches and trunk or treats and things like that. We've said, okay, let's move Halloween back into our neighborhoods again, but really make them where, you're the great neighbor, and you're going to, have one of the best stories we had was someone who rented a, cotton candy machine. And it slowed everybody down because it takes a while to make cotton candy. And he said, but everybody was just hanging around in his house, making cotton candy. He's sticky, full of stuff everywhere, but it was that stickiness that occurred there relationally. And so, you can, as a church that's good at putting on events, you can equip your own members of like, here's a thing that you can do in your neighborhood that makes Halloween a real connected event. So you're gonna, you'll have the fire pit outside, and you're gonna have a hot chocolate and things like that, and you just become a relational connector in your neighborhood and create these events. Or if you, do VBS or something like that, again, put, and you can ease into it. Like we'll do VBS at our church, but we're also going to do some VBSs in some neighborhoods, and eventually you might want to move exclusively to that. We know we didn't do this, but another church did it, and who had been essentially stuck at 300 for 20 years of doing VBS said the next year that they did it as a neighborhood, they had 300 again, but they said it was an entirely different relational depth, and that then it eventually did grow to over 1,000 of kids attending these neighborhood VBSs. Lastly, the point of neighboring isn't that it's just a program. So if neighboring is a program, that means it's going to die eventually, because all programs die. So this needs to be an unprogram. It needs to be not about the church leaders neighboring, but about the people in the church loving their neighbors, and putting on neighboring programs. So again, that example I just gave you, that's great. You implement that. That's like training wheels on a bike, teaching people how to neighbor. But you said you can do this on your own. You do these plus ones, but there are also 4 practices that we've tried to implement into our people to say, just do these 4 things. And so this came from when my girls were little. I thought I'd be a better dad than I was. And so I was okay, but I thought I'd be awesome. and I wasn't. And so I thought, how can I be a better dad? I just need a plan. And so I need a simple plan that I'll remember. And so I came up with 3 things that rhymed. It was cheesy. I know it's cheesy. And then my youngest daughter, when she was 5, gave me a 4th thing. So the 3 things I came up with were stay, pray, and play. No, stay, pray, and say. So stay was stay connected to my kids, pray for my kids, and then say to my kids, I love them. And then when my 5-year-old told me, Daddy, my favorite of you is when you're silly. And I was like, oh, play is important. And so it was those 4 things. So then I realized, okay, this is actually something that'd be good, not just for my kids, but for the other people in my life, including my neighbors, that one, I stay connected to my neighbors. That as simple as I don't know all my neighbors' names. And so how can I say that I'm connected to them and stay in their world if I don't know their names, and then eventually stay in their world by learning their history and their hopes and their hurts, and just to know who they are. That led to being able to pray specifically for them. I could pray more than God bless my neighbor, because I knew my neighbor by name and I knew what they were going for. By the way, I don't even know what to put at the percentage-wise. It's got to be far less than 1% of that I know of of Christians who pray for their literal neighbors. And so that alone would be a game changer if you just said, I'm going to learn my neighbor's name, try to learn a little bit about them, and I'm going to pray for them. And that's it. And then I'll just see what happens. And so, but be able to pray specifically. And you ended up discovering at times that people, they covet this. I remember one time we were at a party with our neighbors, and the person hosting it was talking to my wife, saying something about something that was hard. And then my wife said to her, I'll pray for you about that. And then another lady who wasn't in our neighborhood walked by, and she said, you pray for people? Like, no one prays for me. I want to be prayed for. And so to be prayed for is a big deal. And we've never had anybody say, don't pray for me. It might happen, but that'd be something to say, I'm going to do it anyway. Stop me. And then play, of course. Adults play mostly around food now. And so that's awesome. And so you just invite people over for scruffy hospitality. The more that there's brats and chili involved, the better it is. If it's steak and lobster, you're never going to get invited anywhere. And so keep it simple. And when you get invited to parties, say yes. And then lastly was to say. Eventually, you do need to speak into people's lives. And hopefully you're living a life that invites that invitation to say, so why are you the way you are? And you get that invitation. And I've seen it happen again, in my neighborhood, and 2 neighborhoods we've lived in, people have come to ask to learn more about God. And even now in our current neighborhood, the neighbors across the street and over one left have now had their younger sons come and learn. And I've asked the dad, I said, do you want to sit in and hear from him? Like, nope. Fine. He goes, but we trust you. We don't want them to go to church, but we trust you. And so there is that opportunity eventually to say why you have hope in Jesus Christ. And it's those kinds of practices that they're simple, but there's things in life that have disproportional effect compared to the effort you put into it. And things like learning a neighbor's name is that thing. It took hardly any effort, and it can be a game changer for you. All those things can be.